Well, hello, darlings. Good to see you all. Hang on, let me just do this so I don't accidentally hang something up partway through. Good to see you. Tad here. As usual, on an early Sunday morning or late Saturday night, depending on where in the world you are. Or it could even be a late Sunday morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. Anyway, but I'm here. I'm here, still in the basement of Doom and Destruction, the basement office of Doom and Destruction, as you can see. We have not gotten this part cleared out yet. However, we got counters. We got counters in our kitchen. We're so excited, which means we can start finishing off the kitchen, and then the dominoes begin to fall, as previously described. Anyway, good to see you all. I assume you're all doing well. I hope you are, or else if you're not, you'd be doing something better with your time, like going to an emergency room or a job center or something like that. So I'm going to assume you're all here because things are relatively okay. And we're all going to hang out together. So hello, thank you for joining me. As you can see, I at the last couple of weeks, the dinosaur in the back here was just kind of lying there in a sad, pathetic kind of way, and there was a tail coming out of my head. So I decided I would actually lift him or her up so that they could join the party. There are also cats running around somewhere. So what was I going to mention about anything? So work is proceeding. I am deeply, deeply involved with the copy edit of Navigator's Children, the second half. I already finished the first half. It went off. I'm working on the second half now. Once I am done with that in the next few days, the only thing that will still be hanging over me as far as Navigator's Children goes is the final proofs once it's been typeset. And of course, then you have to go back through the book again to make sure that nothing has changed or it looks weird in typeset, that it didn't look weird in manuscript form, or whatever the case. There's a few reasons why things can happen that make things confusing. But that will be the last step in terms of my involvement with the manuscript itself. I still have to do some work with Isaac Stewart, who is been very kindly involved in so much of the map making all the map making for these books, for this set of books, and it has become one less thing I don't have to do, and besides, he does it better than I do, or at least certainly a lot more attractively and professionally. I suppose that does add up to better. Anyway, so that's what I'm working on. Then when I get done with that, and as I said, in a couple days, I can finish off Ordinary Farm 3 and start my work on The Splintered Sun, which is, as mentioned before, another Ostenard novel, albeit set a few hundred years before the Dragonbone Chair, primarily in Hernistir, but, I'll talk about that when it's happening, because that's still a few months away from me being able to work on it, although I'm working on it in here. And it's actually become kind of a pattern for me that the last thing I do before I go to bed, or before I go to sleep, I'm already in bed, but the last thing I do before I go to sleep is spend, a certain amount of time before I fall asleep pushing the plot, or at least my idea of what the plot is going to be, forward. As I mentioned, I think last week, there is a difference between writing the book in your head and writing the book on paper, but both of them are useful and both of them have their advantages. So since I can't write the book on paper at the moment, meaning The Splintered Sun, I'm writing it in my head right now. So what else is there to talk about? Nothing really major. We've had a few good days here in California, or at least in this part of California. Nice weather, drying out, which is a good thing because, that reminds me of what I was going to mention. I did have a couple of incidents earlier tonight where there was a brief power outage, and it was almost not noticeable, except for the fact that it was enough to force all of my machines to turn off and reboot. So if that happens in the middle tonight, it hasn't happened again since, and that was over an hour ago. So, but if it happens again, that will obviously knock me off I want to say off the air, but we're not really on the air, but it will knock me off online. But I don't think it's going to happen. However, that's one of the things I wanted to say why we're glad when we get a few days of rain, because it's not merely during a storm and the wind and, all that stuff that is the danger when you live up in the hills like we do, to things like the power supply and stuff. But it's just also if the ground gets too wet, some trees become top heavy, and with the ground soft, they just suddenly topple over. And around here, there's always the danger that any falling tree is going to take out the power lines or the phone lines or both. So, but again, I don't think anything's going to happen tonight, but I'm just mentioning it to you. Let me drift over and see who has checked in or who has commented or otherwise made their presence known. I'm sure there were other things I was going to talk about, but my brain is really small. Very small tonight. So I see Christina has checked in. James Hooten. Oh, there's a new name. Hello, James. Nice to have you with us. Wouter, come back. Iris. Tracy. Hello, Tracy. Hazel, my mother-in-law. Hello, sweetie. Your daughter's fine. She's sleeping as she should be, as sensible people should be here in this part of the world at this time of the night. But no, she's doing well. Lots of love to you and all the folks over there in England. Ilva, same to you, except make that Germany. Lots of love to you and all the folks over there. Jeremy, who's right around the corner here. Well, not anymore now that we moved back over the hill. But anyway, hello, Jeremy. Good to see you too, as always. Kristen, a pleasure. James, hello. Chenoa, or Chenoa. I'm still not 100% certain how you want that pronounced. Mark, good to see you, Mark. Nikki, Christy Sanders. James says it's been rough lately. I'm sorry to hear that, James. That is never fun. And Suzanne posted the rather sad comment, I can't remember a full day without rain in Yorkshire. I hope you mean this winter and not throughout your entire life, because that would be depressing beyond saying. And Mark says, love the plastic dinosaur. It's actually a plush dinosaur. It came from the wonderful dinosaur museum in Bozeman, Montana, if I remember correctly. As I said, it was a plush that we got for my daughter when she was at a thing of every time we went somewhere, she had to get a plush from the gift shop. And later, to be perfectly fair to her, later she did use her own money to do this. But when she was younger, of course, we were buying them for you. And she had a gigantic stuffed animal collection. And one day, I will tell you the story of how I learned a very important lesson about disciplining kids over Devon's, our daughter's, plush animal collection, but I won't start into it tonight because by the time I finish, it'll be cutting into the reading time. Wouter says, happy birthday. Wouter seems to be saying that to Ilva. And if so, good God, have I forgotten the birth date of one of my friends? If that's so, hello, happy birthday. It was just mine on Thursday. I am officially older than time itself. There's no doubt about it. It makes me want to sing The Great Historical Bum, which is a classic folk song about I was born about 10,000 years ago. There ain't nothing in the world that I don't know. I taught Pharaoh's little kitties to build all them pyramids, and I'll whoop the guy what says it isn't so. Great song. I grew up on the Chad Mitchell Trio version, but I'm sure there are others. Anyway, so what else was there I wanted to talk about? Not that much, really. Just in working mode. We're trying to live in the chaos that we're in. It's not that bad. It ain't the end of the world. I'll be happy when it gets better. Johnny's having a bad night. I think part of it is, this is our big dog, of course, and I think part of the problem is that during the course of deciding how we were going to remodel the kitchen, we got rid of the laundry room and opened it up and turned it into part of the remodeled kitchen. I will take the blame for this. It was my idea, and we moved the washer and dryer downstairs to what we used to refer to as our Harry Potter room because one of our kids was staying in there, and it's in a way it's kind of under the stairs, so it became a joke, like where Harry lived. But anyway, so we moved that stuff down there, and of course now when somebody's running the washer dryer, there are these thumpy, bumpy, humming sounds coming from under the floorboards. And Johnny is a dog who panics about wind. He panics about rain. He panics about people dropping things on the floor. If you accidentally knock a cereal bowl over on, or a cereal box over on the table, he leaps into the air and runs back about 6 feet. He's on drugs for this. I mean, we have to give him tranquilizers just to keep him relatively happy. But anyway, so he's had a bad couple of nights because the washer and dryer have been running almost consistently through that whole time. And when he's miserable, he comes up to me wherever I am and claws at my leg to let me know that there's a problem. And of course, any dog owner knows when your dog is communicating to you that they need something, since they don't actually talk, unless they're extremely talented or you are a particularly perceptive dog owner, you have to kind of guess. So, of course, that means jumping up, letting them out, seeing if that's what it is, checking their food, checking their water, blah, blah, blah. But with Johnny, it's almost just always that he's nervous, something has worried him, and he wants you to fix it. And, of course, I'm not going to go down and turn off the dryer and the washer that somebody, probably our daughter, is using to get ready to go to work tomorrow. So I just have to sit there petting him for an hour at a stretch to help to calm him down. So that's been my night the last couple of nights, is just petting the dog to the point where I think I'm wearing off his fur. I've lost my fingerprints on my hands. I mean, it's like you can only pet a dog for so long before you start to cause damage to both of you. Anyway, so all of that said, and is there anything else I need to check on in terms of comments? Anybody I missed here? Suzanne, I think I said hello to already, but if I didn't, hello. And so I am going to start reading. So, yes. By the way, I don't know if any of you saw the thing I posted on that was explaining that I was going to be reading tonight. It was a picture of the substitute Legion of Superheroes from the old Legion of Superheroes comic. This won't mean as much to you Europeans, but the Americans out there of roughly my age will probably remember the Legion of Superheroes and how charmingly stupid their whole shtick was. Because, of course, they were supposed to be in like the year, like 1,000 years in the future. So if it was like 1962 when their adventures were being described, then they were supposedly living in the year 2962. And they had, as you can see in the picture, a superheroes clubhouse that looked like a rocket ship. And they had all these like little rituals of like letting people into their club or not letting people into their club. And everybody was so into the Legion of Substitute Heroes, the ones who failed to get into the club, that they would make frequent guest appearances. And this is a particularly good one because they all look so sad at being driven away from the superheroes clubhouse. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that. Okay, so if we've done all the important things, and if everybody is in tune, I am going to start reading. So you may recall, if you've listened to or did listen to at the time the last reading, we ended up with Vieki, who is the High Magister of the Norns Builders Order. Vieki had been sent out of Nakiga, the place where most of the Norns live, out on a mission for the Queen without knowing really what it is, and feeling a little nervous about that because, of course, the last thing anybody among the Norns, the Hikedaya, wants to do is displease the Queen, because if you displease the Queen, you pretty much end up dead, oftentimes after being tortured first. It's not a good thing to do. So that's what Vieki has done. Vieki has just ridden off to go away. Sorry, I'm not talking to you guys. I'm talking to something on my screen. Vieki has just rode away with the with his builders and a surprisingly large troop of soldiers, which he does not understand. But of course, we will find out more about that later on. So now we are switching to another section, an event that has been primed by Viecki leaving, and that is what the state of affairs is for his mortal mistress, whom he named Soja. So that's who we are now with. We're starting a new section with Soja. He is gone, Soja kept thinking over and over. He is gone, and I am alone and helpless in a house full of enemies. She was ashamed of herself for thinking such weak thoughts, and she knew Viecki would have been disgusted, but that was just the problem. For all his wisdom, the one she loved did not understand his own household, his own people, in the same way that she did. How could he? Magister Viecki was a noble, of an old noble family, and he was male. He did not notice the silent hatred that slaves felt for even the kindest masters. He could not grasp the murderousness of a spurned wife. Still, though, despite her worries, she was surprised when the knock on her door came less than a bell after the High Magister had departed. She opened it cautiously and was relieved to discover that it was only one of the serving girls. Soja did not even have a chance to open her mouth before the servant spoke, as emotionless as a cat yawning. My mistress sends to know if you will join her for the evening meal, now that the master is gone. So, the bitch Kimabu was ready to begin hostilities before Viecki had even reached the outskirts of Nakiga that was. Soja was caught off balance and was furious with herself for not being ready. She had expected a respite of a day or so before Viecki's wife began her campaign in earnest, but excuse me, but obviously that was not to be. The easiest thing to do would be to refuse, of course, to claim she didn't feel well. That was probably what Lady Kimabu expected. In fact, that might very well be the excuse Viecki's wife would use to take Soja into her own care, and then to make sure that the mortal woman's health took a sudden and surprising turn for the worse. Good sense dictated she should go nowhere near Kimabu's end of the residence. Tell your mistress that I offer her many thanks, and will come at the appointed hour. The servant gave no sign of surprise, except for a very slight hesitation before bowing and retreating, but Soja knew she had managed an unexpected maneuver. She could only hope that either it would intrigue Kimabu enough to convince her to hold off a little longer, or that the dinner was only meant to be an exploratory gambit anyway, the opening of a cat-and-mouse game that could keep the lady of the house cheerfully occupied during the early days of her husband's absence. Still, Soja knew it was a very dangerous gamble on her own part. She was not entirely helpless. She had a poison stone to protect her, one she had brought with her from her days in the household of Vlada Roskva so many long years ago, or so many to Soja, at any rate. But poison was only one of the many ways the mistress of the house could remove Soja as a rival. All the centuries the Norns have lived in this dark mountain, she thought. How can a people live this way, hiding from the sunshine, barely sipping at the light as though it were some dangerously potent liquor? But it was no good to yearn after sunlight, however much she missed it now. This mountain was where Soja would have to make her stand if she was to survive, and the most dangerous skirmish yet was only hours away. She began to take garments from the cedar wood chest. Dressing to confront a rival was a difficult chore in any situation, but dressing for a rival who embodied a race with a history and outlook so different from hers, a rival who also wanted her dead, made the choices even more complicated. As she held up and considered two possible gowns, Soja wondered if she dared carry her poison stone with her. If she did, she would need a place to hide it, a billowing sleeve or something similar where she could reach it quickly when the situation presented itself, and then hide it away again just as swiftly. She lifted it from the secret box where she kept the few mementos of her precious previous life and held it up to the flickering light of her lamp so she could see its tiny holes, delicate as Pedruinese lace. She was certain it had saved her at least once when she had first arrived in the household, and she certainly would feel much safer with it somewhere near her hand. But to be caught with such a thing tonight would be a mortal insult. If it were discovered, Kimabu would not need to destroy her in secret, but could claim that Soja was carrying it because she herself had put something poisonous in the meal. At the very least, Kimabu could send Soja back to the slave barracks without Vieki's protection, making her available to any Hikedaya male who wished to claim her. She did not doubt that in such a situation Lady Kimabu would be happy to send a few suitors Soja's way, the rough sort who might have an accident with a fragile, mortal woman. Reluctantly, she set the poisoned stone back in the small box and hid it once more behind the panel. If she truly was to dine at Kimabu's table, it would be without protection. She would be staking everything on one throw of the dice. Still, what chance did she have otherwise? The lady of the house, especially a lady as well-born and well-connected as Kimabu, always had all the power. Soja, as usual, would only have her wits. Such an uneven contest, she thought. But is life itself any different? That is a game nobody wins. Even the Hikedaya eventually must die. Except for their queen, of course, Soja reminded herself. In any country, in any time, the Norn queen remained the exception to all rules. I give you greetings in the name of the queen and the garden. Lady Kimabu did not rise from her low couch. Her pet ermine poked its head out of her voluminous sleeve and gave Soja a brief critical appraisal before disappearing once more. As do I, great lady, Soja replied. I thank you for inviting one such as me to your table. The honor is above me. She waited to be asked to sit, although since there were only 2 couches set out, it was fairly obvious where her place was to be. Kimabu did not seem in a great hurry to indulge her. No need for false modesty, dear younger sister Soja. All know the great service you have performed for our master's house. But I see you have dressed with a modesty that befits your humility. Soja bowed. She had put on her finest gown, of course, an intricate weave of flowing, faintly shimmering spin silk beaded with tiny pearls. This was just Kimabu's way of poking at her, reminding her of her low station in the household. The gown was not showy, it was true, but no auxiliary wife, still less a mortal one, would make the mistake of outdressing the mistress of the household. Kimabu wore a beautiful billowing swirl of pale green, with gold tones that glowed beneath the outer fabric, the whole garment covered with an elaborate fretwork of knotted cords in darker green. Donning such a gown was the work of several servants over a goodly amount of time. Kimabu's beauteous swirl of dark hair and her peerless face had also been brought to perfection with the help of many trained hands. Come, sit, Soja, she said. There is no need for such formality with me. The sort of intimacy we share makes us family. Kimabu spread her long fingers just below her chin, an ancient formal gesture called the fan that indicated a kind of pleasure at the speaker's own daring. As Soja lowered herself onto the couch with as much grace as she could manage, none of the 6 servants came forward to help her. The ermine poked its head out of Kimabu's sleeve again. Its eyes were like black stones set into the white fur of the face. It abruptly slithered across its mistress and vanished into her other sleeve. The creature's brief reappearance gave Soja the beginning of an idea. You are most kind, my lady, she said out loud. "It is an honor to join you. I have always thought that this was one of the most beautiful rooms in this beautiful house." In truth, the dining salon was quite striking, a room many times as high as it was wide, not uncommon among the Hikedaya, whose greatest sign of wealth and privilege was access to the light wells that stretched across the northern and southern faces of Do Nakiga, the mountain Soja had once called Stormspike. Never in her childhood had she ever dreamed that she would one day be living in such a terrifying, infamous place. The salon's stone walls were softened ever so slightly by long hangings decorated with what Soja had come to understand was a sort of poetry, bits of old tales about the garden or praise of the queen, painted in ways Vieki's people found pleasing to the eye. The few pieces of furniture in the room were spare, made from polished black and gray stone, another habit of the Hikedaya, who largely shunned color in their homes, though not always on their persons. The green gown her enemy wore would be considered a very daring thing to wear outside of this house. Kimabu was beautiful. There was no doubting it. Soja had grown up among people who thought the Norns demons and monsters, but if they could see Kimabu's sculpted features, her long, regal nose, her splendid high cheekbones, and large, liquid black eyes, they would have had to admit she was a lovely demon indeed. "You stare at me," Kimabu said, and made the fan sign again, but this time with a small twist at the end that suggested a certain impatience. "Has it really been so long since we have spent time together, dear younger sister, that you have forgotten how I look? I know that time seems to pass more swiftly for your people." A glint in the eye, the meaning quite clear. "Forgive me if I have been forgetful." "No, lady, I am, as always, astonished to find your beauty is even greater in life than it was in my memory." Kimabu laid one finger beside her cheek, a gesture Soja did not immediately recognize. "You flatter me, my dear one. You have charms of your own, as you well know." "In other words, my husband liked you well enough to bed you, and if you hadn't borne a child, you would have been back in the slave pens long ago, or worse." Soja spread her hands in what she knew was a clumsy version of a Hikedaya gesture, but whose meaning was too clear to mistake. How can anyone guess what males will do? "I am grateful," is what she said out loud. Kimabu made a tiny gesture. One of the bound servants left his position against the wall and was at his mistress's side so quickly he seemed almost to dissolve and reform. "You may serve," she told him. The ermine was out again and watching Soja, whiskers twitching. She had never liked Kimabu's pet. Its eyes were too bright, too intrusive. It felt like she was being watched by an unpleasant child. But for once, as she watched it, frisking in and out of Kimabu's sleeves and around the low couch, she was grateful for its presence. The servants brought dishes to the table. Roasted glacier waxwings and the bitter puja bread made from the barley grown in the cold valleys below Stormspike's eastern flank, cooked in the ashes of a fire until it was as crisp and hard as wood. The Hikedaya had a great fondness for it, but Soja had never learned to like it. All she ever tasted was the ashes. As she made appropriate sounds about the arrangement and quality of the food, she took a morsel of puja in her hand and broke off a piece, then pretended to take a bite, rolling it between thumb and fingers until she had made it into a stiff ball. She then dropped it onto the floor as surreptitiously as she could and kicked it with equal caution toward Kimabu's couch. "And the birds look especially delicious," she said out loud, doing her best not to make it obvious she was also watching the floor. As was the custom, the waxwings were served all but whole, feathers scorched away, but feet and heads still attached. the beaks like black thorns, the eyes like burned currants. The ermine had noticed the morsel of bread and now balanced on the edge of the couch, nose twitching. It looked up at her with a nasty twinkle, as if it knew what she was doing, but after a moment, as Soja pretended to take another bite, it leaped down and snapped up the small tidbit, then slithered back onto the couch. As you know, our generous lord, High Magister Viecki, has been given a great honor by the mother of all, said Kimabu. All blessings upon her. The queen has put 40-fold soldiers at his command to watch over and guard his engineers and laborers. It's quite wonderful how the queen recognizes my master's worth, said Soja dutifully. Judging by the still twitching nose and malicious little bead eyes, the ermine was not suffering from his taste of puja. This time Soja took an actual bite, doing her best to hide her dislike of its harsh flavor. Do you know where he is bound? By the garden, no. Kimabu made another graceful gesture, this one signifying that it was beyond her powers to know the counsels of the wise. He goes at the queen's bidding and is sworn to secrecy. It is clearly a mission of some importance, though, so we must bear the burden of his absence bravely. She spread her hands in a double fan. She was changing the subject. But you have already had to bear the sadness of your daughter's absence, although that brings high honor to our house as well. Imagine, despite her drawbacks, she is a queen's talon. She was very lucky to be chosen, but of course the queen is never wrong. Never. And Nezuru, so young. Soja had flicked a couple of shreds of the roasted waxwing into the ermine's hunting range while concentrating on her pudra. She did her best to watch without seeming to, as the little creature approached, sniffed, and then gobbled them down. Another few moments, then, if the animal survived, she could move on to eating some of the bird as well, which to this point she had only pushed around on her platter. You have been very kind to Nezuru, Lady Kimabu. You have treated her with the kindness you would show your own daughter. That was a dreadful exaggeration. Kimabu had never been anything other than coldly correct to her husband's child by another woman, but neither of the two women were paying much attention to what the other appeared to be saying. Oh, it is only right to do so. Is she not my husband's child? Have you not gifted us, gifted our entire household with her birth? The bland look on Kimabu's face was indistinguishable from murderous rage, but that was usually true with the Hikedaya. But you must fear for her, so far away. I do, but I trust in the queen's wisdom. As Soja watched, the ermine coiled itself on Kimabu's shoulder and almost seemed to be paying attention to the conversation. The animal did not appear to have been poisoned, though, so Soja began picking at her own bird with the scraping fork the Hikedaya preferred to use on cooked meat, taking it only in small quantities. My Lord Viecki once told me that part of the reason for our daughter's swift advancement was your own family's support of her, my lady. That was very generous of you. Kimabu's gesture was a strange one. Water on flat rock, which usually meant that all would be revealed in the fullness of time. The Magister's wife seemed to notice this herself only after the beginning, because she quickly turned it into a more ordinary sign, one that represented a carefully prescribed amount of social gratitude. That which helps my husband helps me and all my family. Not that my relatives are themselves overlooked or unappreciated. The Queen has often been kind enough to take notice of them. Your uncle is high in one of the orders, I've been told, but I have never known the details. Soja had always assumed it must be the Order of Sacrifice, since that was the order that had taken Nezuru and awarded her with great responsibility. For once, the conversation and her actual curiosity had dovetailed in an acceptable way. "Is it permitted to ask which order?" Kimabu's eyes positively glittered with what looked to Soja like malicious amusement, although her face showed nothing that was not correct. "Of course it is permissible to ask, dear little sister. We share so much already. My uncle, Iñaki, is one of the chief clerics in the employ of Akanabi, Lord of the Order of the Song." A sudden chill ran up Soja's spine. A singer? Why had she not known that? Why had Vieki never told her? As she sat temporarily dumbfounded, the ermine abruptly scrambled from Kimabu's shoulder, down the lady's sleeve, and onto the pale leather of the couch beside her. A moment later, it made a little noise and began to vomit, spewing out a tiny pile of gristle and sludge and pale liquid. Soja could only stare in horrified fascination, the meat in her own mouth suddenly unchewable because her tongue had gone dry as dust. "Ah, my little companion seems to have had a bit too much of this rich food," said Kimabu, a smile in her voice, if not on her face. "Have you been stealing from our plates, tiny villain? Have you been making free with everyone's supper?" She turned her mask-like face toward Soja. "He is terrible, you know. He will eat anything and everything without caution. He would poison himself if I did not constantly watch him." "Why, what is wrong, Soja? You look quite pale for one of your complexion. Please don't worry for him. He will be fine soon. I'll have a servant clean up right now if it puts you off your meal." "Actually, I'm afraid I am feeling a bit unwell," Soja said. "I think, like your pet, the food is a bit rich for me." "Familiar?" said Kimabu. "What?" "That is what we always called such animals growing up. Not pets, but familiars. They are so much more than mere pets." And as if to demonstrate the truth of this, the ermine looked up from its own pool of sick and stared right at Soja. She could almost have sworn it was amused. She got up, her legs shaky. The bitch Kimabu had been toying with her all along. She must have seen everything. What a fool! What a failure I must appear to this beautiful, heartless creature, Soja thought. A cheap, shabby copy that some craftsman had thrown aside, half-finished. "Please forgive me, Lady Kimabu. Your hospitality has been most kind, your conversation most enlightening." "But you are not unwell, are you? How sad." She made the spread hand sign of sorrowful condolence, exaggerated to make clear its insincerity, Soja felt sure. "We were just beginning to talk." "I do apologize. I think I need to lie down." "But of course. We will continue this at supper, tomorrow night then, if you are well enough. Now that my husband is absent, this is my chance to get to know you properly. I would not let anything interfere with that." Once she had backed out of the dining salon, Soja hurried back across the great house to her own chamber on shaking legs, her heart booming in her chest so that it seemed everyone behind the closed doors of the silent hall must hear it. "She will kill me, but she'll play with me first, because she enjoys it." Soja could barely breathe as she fumbled with the latch. "I cannot stay here, but there is nowhere safe for me in this haunted country, or any way to leave it." She closed the door behind her, locked it with latch and bolt, then forced herself to vomit the few scraps she'd eaten into her chamber pot before tumbling onto her bed, breathless with despair. Chapter 35. The Man with the Odd Smile. "Hurry up, child! The Duchess is waiting for you." Even though Duke Saluceris was not present, his ancient valet, Oren still considered himself chief among the servants of the Domos Benedrian, the family palace built by the first Benedrivis some 200 years earlier. Jeza sometimes thought stiff old Oren might actually have been there since the first stones were laid. He certainly acted like it. "Her lady said to clean and swaddle the baby, Master Oren," she said, trying to keep the irritation from her voice, but not succeeding. "And that is what I am doing." She would not have dared speak back to a superior servant in her first years with the Duchess, but Jeza knew her place now, and also knew that it would take a fairly serious breach of courtesy for Duchess Canthea to turn against her. "Her ladyship, you swamp brat, not her lady. How can a servant in a great house not be able to speak correctly?" "It is not even your tongue," Jeza replied somewhat daringly. "It is old King John's tongue, and you do not speak it so goodly either." She was not satisfied with the swaddling, so she unwrapped little Saracina and began again. "And I am here for caring for the baby, not for making your ears happy." Oren shook his head. "This," he said grimly, "this is just what I have said. Even servants these days are insolent." "Not insolent," Jeza said, "just busy, much busy." Ah, if Oren only understood the Ranneman tongue, how she would put him in his place. The language of her birth had many, many ways for a woman to correct a man who set himself too highly. After a moment's consideration, she decided a translation might still carry the meaning. "Now, if you have nothing to do but hang from a branch, you might as well go back to your nest and make spit bubbles." It didn't quite carry the same weight as the original, which likened an unwanted commentator to one of the Gants, horrid, murderous creatures that infested the back ways of the marshy Ran, but conveyed her general meaning. "Disrespectful beast," said Oren. "Talk sense." But he seemed to lose interest in scolding her further and wandered off, presumably to bark at the grooms or the coachman about something. Jeza finished little Saracina's swaddling, testing it with her finger to make sure the blanket was not wrapped either too loosely or too tightly. The baby made a pop-eyed face and let out a minuscule belch. Jeza laughed and picked her up, then carried her as carefully out to the stairs and down to the front doors as if she were her own baby. The coach, a great rectangular chamber on wheels, was waiting for them on the cobbled forecourt. Jeza made a curtsy, then handed little Saracina up to her mother before climbing the steps. "Will she be warm enough?" the Duchess asked, frowning in concern. If anyone found Naban chilly, it was Jeza, child of the humid swamps, but the day was lovely, a near-perfect Avril morning, with only a small hint of a breeze, and the morning fog long since scoured from the hills on which the Domos Benedrian perched. "It is a good day, Your Grace. I believe she is warm enough." "Are you sure?" "Oh, I worry so. Just se'night last I heard a terrible story of a fever in Portofalesis." "She is very strong, your little one. Look, see her look around. She is not cold and sick. She likes the air." "I hope so." The Duchess squeezed her daughter tightly for a moment, then handed her back to Jeza. "But you are right. It's a lovely day to be out." She knocked on the carriage roof. As the driver snapped the reins and the team of horses began to pull, Canthea nodded and smiled at the servants lined up to see them off, more than 24 of the household staff altogether, maids and grooms and valets. As the carriage rolled across the grounds and through the palace gates, all the hills of Naban were laid out before them. The Domos Benedrian stood above the vineyards and other palaces of one of the great hills, the Antigene, and had a fine view of the other two tallest crests, the Redenturine, home of the Sancellan Adenitis, the heart of Mother Church, and the steep Magistravine, that rose above the harbor with the ducal palace at its peak like a figurehead on the bow of a ship. Because of her humble beginnings in the Rand, Jeza had never got used to the idea of riding in the ducal carriage. There were only 4 or 5 such carriages in all Naban. One belonged to the lector himself, and fewer than a dozen in all the known world, her mistress had once told her. It was also a painful ride. Even on smooth dirt the carriage jounced, and on cobblestones at speed she felt like she was sitting on a branch in high wind, struggling to hold on while it whipped up and down. But just now the driver was in no hurry, and the horses were all pulling strongly and evenly. Little Saracina had been fed by the wet nurse before being changed, and had already dropped into the sleep of innocence. As they made their way down the steeply winding road, people came out to look and sometimes to wave or cheer, and the Duchess looked out on her subjects with a fixed smile. As some children leaped up and down, shouting in excitement, Canthia smiled more broadly and waved back, but except for that brief moment, the Duchess seemed almost sad. "Is everything right, Your Grace?" The Duchess nodded. "All is well, Jeza. I just cannot help worrying about my husband. He should have come here to the hill with Saracina and me, but I could not convince him. He works so hard. I fear he will make himself ill." "He is strong, your husband," said Jeza. "In some ways." Duchess Canthia smiled. "But in some ways he is like all men, strong without bending. And things that do not bend, well, sometimes they break." Jeza did not understand this. From everything she understood, many of the people in Naban who were angry with the Duke thought he was too forgiving, that he was allowing his brother and the Albatross people, what were their names, too much freedom to complain and make trouble. In Gadarene House, she remembered then, the Albatross was House in Gadarus, just as the Kingfisher was House Benedrivis. The rival families of Naban were harder to keep track of than even the village squabbles she had grown up with, and their complicated old stories about which fishing spot belonged to which family. Having money and carriages and stone houses did not seem to keep drylanders from fighting with each other just as much as marsh folk. After a while, as the carriage descended from the hill into the close, cramped neighborhoods of the poor, fewer people gathered to cheer the ducal carriage, although many still stood to watch them pass. Looking at the faces, Jeza could not help feeling a shiver of worry at the scowls many of them wore. But when the road swung out and followed the course of the great canal, she began to have an idea why so many of them looked angry. A great swath of buildings along the canal had been burned. Some of them still leaked plumes of smoke into the gray sky. At the turn of a bend, she could see that a broad cloud of smoke hung over the near side of the city as well, just inside the walls. Now she remembered a messenger telling her mistress the previous night that there had been a riot in the warehouse district. But surely that had happened 2 or 3 days ago, so the messenger had said. Why were some of the buildings still burning? It was well into the afternoon by the time they reached the city. The chief gate warden came out in full regalia to speak to them when the carriage stopped in front of the huge iron and timber north gate. He stood on the carriage steps and had to take off his broad hat to get his head in at the window on the door. "Why are the gates closed, warden?" asked Canthia. "It is the middle of the day." "Your Grace, there is trouble in Tellus Narasi." That was a poor neighborhood on the other side of the gates, Jeza knew, inhabited primarily by immigrants from the southern islands. She also knew that it was close to the Patarine Hill, where Dallo Ingadarus kept his townhouse. She wondered if Duke Saluceris's arrival had something to do with the disturbance. Jeza might wonder, but Duchess Canthia had no doubts. "A curse on Count Dallo," she said. "He should have cleared this rabble from the streets himself." "Is there a better way around?" "Your Grace can have her driver continue around to the port gate." the chief warder said. "If you go that way, you can come up Harbor Way to the Mahastravine Road." "That will take hours or more," the Duchess said. "I have a hungry child in my carriage." She looked over at Jeza as if contemplating the strength of her own forces. "Please, mistress," Jeza said quietly, "let us do what this good man says. Let us go around." "No one will harm the Duke's child," Canthia declared, "and no one will harm the Duchess. This is Naban, not some backwater. There is a sacred law of safe passage inside the city." Jeza knew nothing about such a law, but she did know that people were not supposed to set roofs on fire either, and yet a cloud of black smoke hung just a short distance away over the city wall. Once people broke one rule, they did not usually wait long before breaking another. "No, mistress, I beg you, think of your child." "It is my child I'm thinking of," said the Duchess. "I will not let my husband's brother and his bullies forbid the Duke's family the use of our own streets." She turned to the gate warden. "Open them up, Captain. We will drive through." The warden's reluctance showed in his face, but he waved to the guards in the gatehouse, and they turned the great windlass. The gate slowly swung open, and the driver urged the horses through, with the warden still standing on the carriage step. "Merchant's Road is blocked just up ahead, Your Grace," the warden said. "You cannot go that way. If you insist, you must go by Sailmaker's Road, but even so I cannot let you go with no more than a driver and 2 guards. I will give you 8 of my riders to clear your way." "Do you not need them to protect the gate?" asked the Duchess. He gave her a look of helplessness. "Please, Your Grace, it is a bad day for you to be abroad in the city. Let me help as I can." "Very well. We will go up Sailmaker's Road." She looked down at her baby, still cradled in Jaza's arms. "I thank you for your thoughtfulness, Warden." "It is my duty, Your Grace. I wish I could do more, but I wish even more that you would reconsider." He darted a look at Jaza, so worried that he was willing to seek an ally even in a Rana-woman nursemaid. "I wish in truth you would turn your carriage around and return to your house in the hills." "That cannot be, Warden." Duchess Canthia's tone made the end of the conversation quite clear. 8 petty knights with lances formed up in front of the carriage before they started forward again. Following the gate warden's suggestion, the driver turned the wide carriage into Sailmaker's Road, which ran along the great canal in the shadow of the walls. But after they had left that broad thoroughfare, they found themselves in a series of narrow back streets, where their progress slowed to a walking man's pace. Once they had to stop and change the hitching of the horses to get around a tight corner, setting the tired beasts in 3 rows so that they could make their way through the tight space between the looming buildings. None of those who watched in curiosity as this lengthy trick was performed seemed anything other than interested to see Duchess Canthia at such close range, but Jaza did not like the way they crowded up to peer in the windows while the carriage was stopped. She put her back to the nearest window, trying to protect baby Saracina from staring eyes. They finally reached the wider Harbor Road, which mounted toward the Mahastravine Hill and the San Salin from the west. With the sun now at their backs but still high in the sky, Jaza felt her heart beating more easily. Then the vast carriage rattled to a stop again. "We cannot go further this way, Your Grace," called the driver. "Why ever not?" the Duchess asked. One of the petty knights brought his horse close to the carriage. "There's an ostler's wagon overturned at the far side of St. Levenon's Square, Your Grace. The square is full, and they are breaking open his casks." He was looking at something neither the Duchess or Jaza could see. "Oh, merciful Elysia," he said quietly. "What? What is it?" "Someone has lit the cart on fire, Your Grace." He stood in his stirrups and shouted to the driver, "Hurry, man! You must turn this carriage around. We will be trapped here. The mounted knights moved in beside the carriage as the driver began to pull the horses around, but already the crowd in the square was pushing in close, most of the people simply curious, a few conspicuously drunk. Jeza moved in toward the middle of her seat as the faces of those who managed to wriggle forward between the mounted guards leered in from both sides. I cannot turn it around without unhitching the horses, the driver called. But I do not. Duchess Canthia waited for a long moment. Outside, the crush of people was actually making the carriage shake. It was all Jeza could do not to scream in fear, but she did not want to upset baby Saracina, who had just awakened and was goggling her eyes, trying to decide whether to cry or not. Driver? The Duchess called. Driver! The crush was so great now that the carriage swayed continuously. Jeza caught a glimpse of a face she had not seen before, a strange-looking, disheveled man with an even stranger smile, who seemed content to stand a short distance back from the carriage, peering in at them. One of the petty knights appeared at the window. Your Grace, someone has pulled the driver off the carriage. You are in danger if you remain here. Come with me, onto my horse. We will have to cut our way out. But before the Duchess could reply, the knight suddenly toppled from his saddle and was swallowed up by the sea of people. His horse high-stepped away into the crowd, knocking people down while making a squealing noise that Jeza had never heard an animal make before. Together with the shrieks of those the beast trod upon, the din grew so piercingly loud that Jeza thought she was losing her mind. Duchess, she cried, we have to run. We must get out and run. The dark-haired man with the odd grin was back near the carriage window again, staring as though he watched an enjoyable performance, even as others rocked the vehicle from side to side. There was something strange about the man's face, beside the fixed smile, something rough and odd and unusual about his skin. Jeza could also see more than a few red albatross badges scattered through the crowd, and nary a kingfisher. It's a trap, she cried. They will murder us. Nonsense, said Canthia, but her eyes said she did not entirely believe what she was saying. My husband's crest is on the carriage. They will never dare to harm their Duchess or their Duke's child. Now the vehicle swayed even more violently, so that Jeza slid from her seat and into the Duchess. It was only luck that little Saracina was not crushed between them. Get out! Get out! Jeza shouted, but she could barely hear herself above the shouts from the surrounding crowd. She reached for the door beside the Duchess, but the press of people outside was too thick, and the door would not open. Suddenly the whole carriage tipped sideways. Jeza turned to her own side and saw the man with the odd smile again, but now he was climbing in through the window. She is calling me, the man said. His grin was fixed like a stone carving, and he spoke as calmly as if he continued a conversation he and Jeza had begun earlier. He first worked his shoulders through the carriage window, then his arms. Duchess Canthia had fallen forward as the carriage tipped and could not get up from where she was, wedged between the seat and the floor. The intruder reached toward the baby in Jeza's arms, and she saw that he had a sharpened wooden stake in one hand. I'm summoned by the whisper. I must go to her, the smiling man said, so offhandedly he might have been talking to himself. But it is such a long way, so I will bring her a gift, something warm. Jeza managed to get her foot up and kicked the intruder full in the face, but he only fell back a short way and managed to gouge her leg with his stake, drawing blood before she could pull it back. He began to climb again until he had forced his entire upper body into the carriage. Jessa gave the baby to Duchess Canthia and did her best to shield the tiny body with her own, kicking and hitting out at the intruder, but this time he blocked the blows with his free arm and continued to clamber in, still grinning. The last thing I will ever see, that terrible face, Jeza thought. Then suddenly the man's demented grin contracted in puzzlement. A moment later, he was jerked backward out of the carriage. Jeza did not see what happened, but heard a whistling cry that began as rage and ended as nothing. A lacy spray of blood splashed the carriage window frame. The noise outside abruptly changed. The cacophony of voices grew louder and more shrill, but now Jeza also heard the thunder of shod hooves on cobblestone, then screams and other dreadful noises that, if less human, might have come from a butcher's yard. The carriage stopped swaying. Another face appeared in the window. To Jeza's surprise, the newcomer's skin was as dark as her own, but he wore shiny armor. He had taken off his helmet, and his broad, handsome face was full of worry. "Your Grace, do you live?" he asked, trying to sort out who was who in the muddle into which Jeza, the Duchess, and the baby had fallen. "Yes, I live," the Duchess said from beneath Jeza. "And thanks to our beloved ransomer, the Adon, my baby also lives. Who are you?" "Viscount Maitrew of Spenit, your Grace. We have met before, but it was long ago. Thanks be to God that my men and I were riding this way. We have put the rabble to flight. Are you injured?" "Not as far as I can tell," Canthia said. "Will you get off me now, Jeza, so I can speak to our rescuer?" "Thank you." The Duchess worriedly examined little Saracina, but the baby seemed to be no worse than startled by events. I'm going to read for a couple more minutes just to finish this section. "What do we do now? Can we drive on?" "I fear your driver is dead, and so are several of your guards," said Maitrew. "And both of the wide roads out of this square are blocked. We will have to take you and your child and your servant onto our horses." Jeza thought she had never seen a man so admirable, in part because she felt sure that without his intervention, she and her mistress and innocent little Saracina would all be dead. In that moment, if someone had told her the dark-skinned Viscount was one of the Adenite god's angels, she would have seriously considered turning her back on he who always steps on sand to embrace a new faith. But her joy and wonder were short-lived. As she was helped out of the carriage and saw the way it had been defaced and damaged, and then caught sight of the bodies lying on the ground, she swooned and stumbled, and would have fallen had not one of Count Matreus's soldiers leaned down from his saddle and caught her arm. Jeza felt as though she dreamed. Things that had happened and things that were happening now were swirled together with little to tell them apart. She would remember little of the ride to the Sancellan Mahastrevis except the smoke in the air and the puzzled, sometimes hostile look of the citizens they passed. As they made their slow way up the hill, Duchess Canthia rode in front of the Viscount, carrying her baby, while Jeza clung to the back of one of the other knights. She had never been on a horse before, and the experience was only slightly less frightening than what had happened in the carriage. The one thing she definitely saw, and would wish ever afterward that she hadn't, was beside the carriage when she first stepped down. The smiling man's head was no longer attached to his body. Both parts of him lay on the cobbles just a short distance away, each surrounded by a pool of shiny blood, and the severed head still wore the same strange grin. And that's where we're going to stop. That's where we're going to stop now and start again tomorrow. Hello, I do English can. Anyway, so with that, I'm going to close that up, and we are going to get ready to say good night for the night. I hope you have all... You, go away. I don't want you. Go away! Why is the chats thing now overwhelming my... Oh, for God's sakes. Ridiculous. Okay. Bum, 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 bum. So, with that... Okay. Yeah. Excuse me. Boy, I'm falling apart here. With that, I say thank you for joining me. I will continue with Jeza and all that stuff at 7 p.m. later today. technically speaking, although for me it will be after I go to sleep for a while. Excuse me, I'm coughing a bit. But as always, I want to thank you for joining me. It's a great pleasure to spend time with you. I want you to take good care of yourselves, your loved ones, your friends and neighbors. I will endeavor to do the same with mine, although in truth I spend most of my effort supporting the psychological health of my useless dogs and my new but still useless cats. But other than that, got no complaints. So thank you for joining me. Peace, be well. See you very soon. Night.